Everybody, Questwise here, and in this video we're going to continue our series on magic in role-playing games. This particular episode is going to be a little bit different. It was not the episode I was planning on doing right after the Vancian Magic video, but this was requested by a viewer, and it got me to thinking, it got me to doing some research, and what we're going to explore today is the magic of Middle-earth via Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And we'll be looking at how magic in Middle-earth functions. And then towards the end of this video, we'll be talking about how it's incorporated, or how you can incorporate these ideas into your role-playing games. There are a few role-playing games out there based on Tolkien's Middle-earth. There's the MERP, the Middle-earth role-playing, which I'll do a completely separate video on because I have some thoughts about that game, good and bad. There's also the One Ring role-playing game, which is coming out again soon, the second edition, I believe, through Free League Publishing. Is that right? I think so. And then there's also Adventures in Middle-earth that is now, I believe, out of print. But we'll talk about that at the end of the video. So magic in Middle-earth is very unique. It's different from what we experience in most role-playing games. In most role-playing games, and I'm speaking directly towards like Dungeons and Dragons, because it's the widest, most well-known game. It's definitely different, and there's a different vibe to the magic in Middle-earth. The magic in Middle-earth is very immersive. It's a part of the land, it's a part of the people that live in those lands, and it's not flashy. There are no fireballs. There's no real lightning bolts. There's none of these very outwardly offensive spells being cast on the battlefield or in dungeons and whatnot. The magic is very pervasive, and it's almost an essence of the world itself. And we'll go through several of these, and I'll explain to you what I mean by all those big fancy words. The magic in Middle-earth is very much tied to the world itself, and there are different aspects of this. I don't think that Tolkien really had in mind, when he was writing Lord of the Rings, to come up with a very strict magic system, like a very rigid system of how the magic works. I think it was just something that sort of was it was inspired by folklore and folk tales and mythology, and I think as the world grew, as he wrote these stories, and we're going to be focusing more on just the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, not so much the Silmarillion. We'll talk about that maybe later, and how magic and the idea of magic sort of changes through the different ages of Middle-earth. But for this video, we're going to be focusing on just the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. There are lots of different ways the magic is exhibited throughout the books and throughout the stories written. One of them is prophecy. So the idea of prophecy, of foretelling the future, is huge, but there's a very strong presence of that throughout the books. And now I'm not going to cover every single item, every single possibility of magic in Lord of the Rings in Middle-earth. What I want to focus on is just some of the most prominent ones that are there, and then how maybe you can incorporate those into your role-playing games themselves. Prophecy is well established. Couple of examples. Both Boromir and Faramir have what Tolkien refers to as true dreams about the ring. The idea that it's not a dream where you're just, it's a possibility. They actually have dreams that tell them exactly, they're true dreams. it's almost a prophetic dream that they have about the One Ring and about the coming of Sauron and the forces and the war of the ring that's going to happen. Elrond is several times being told to have the gift of foresight, that he can see the future, he can see the possibilities of things that are coming. Galadriel's mirror allows her to see the future, allows her to invoke some prophetic type of magic. We'll get into that more when we talk about the magic items in Middle Earth. So there's a few examples of prophecy, the idea of being able to see the future, and a lot of the references lie. Most of the references to magic are actually either tied to the Elvish people or to the Istari, or the wizards. And in fact, in the index of the book Return of the King, Tolkien writes that wizardry is ascribed as the work of wizards, which is an awesome line, but really explains nothing, right? Wizardry is ascribed as the work of wizards. Okay. What does he mean by wizardry? And if you dig deeper, there's really not a lot of extra explanation to that. But I'm thinking that wizardry, in this sense at least, refers to the fact of actively working magic, doing magical things, casting spells, or invoking magical abilities. Where the Elvish magic is sort of inborn. It's part of their essence. It's part of who they are and what they are, and that they're very much tied to the land and to the history of Middle Earth. Animism is another form of magic that it pops up a little bit. Animism being sort of the magic of the land, that everything has a spirit or a soul, and that it can be sort of invoked or interacted with. There is a line that talks about, and I did not write down, I apologize for this, I did not write down the actual page or what book it's in, but there's a line where it says that the stones speak of the elves who once lived there, giving the rise of the idea that there are, that even the stones have a spirit. The stones can be interacted with. That the land itself has memory, which in a sense is a form of magic. The land itself is alive. The trees, the stones, the earth itself is a magical force behind it. Then we look at magical items. There are a lot of magical items in Middle Earth, in Lord of the Rings, in The Hobbit. We have the doors of Durin in Khazad-dûm, right? We have these doors that will not open for anyone unless the secret word is spoken. This is even what's interesting about the doors of Durin, is that it even baffles Gandalf for a period of time. It's something that sort of, even Gandalf, who is a wizard, is an Istari, he's a part of a almost like an angelic being. It baffles him even. So the idea that there's magic out there that's very ancient, that's very old, that's very mysterious, even to somebody like Gandalf, is very interesting to me. It really invokes the idea that magic in Middle Earth is something that's very pervasive. It's very ingrained in everything. It's very powerful, even though it's not doing lots of damage to an enemy, or it's not doing lots of destruction to the land, kind of thing. So the doors of Durin. Galadriel's mirror, we talked about this a little bit earlier, allows her to look in and see across time and across whatever. It allows her the gift of prophecy. The Palantir, right, the Seeing Stones, most prominent in the fact that Saruman has one. We also know that Sauron has one as well too. There's a line, in fact I was just reading this last night before bed, that Aragorn talks to, I want to say it's Legolas, and he says he looked into the stone, and he and Sauron was afraid because he was the king returning of the ancient bloodline, right? of the lineup is Isildur, and so there's this idea that these seeing stones are able to allow you to communicate across vast distances. Then there are tons of weapons, right? We have Sting, we have Andoril, which is reforged from the shards of Narsil. We have Glamdring, which was Gandalf's sword. Uh, in the Hobbit, we have Orcrist, which was Thorin Oakenshield's sword. Um, Magical weapons, and this is what I find interesting. Again, like Tolkien was writing well before any role playing games were out, so he had nothing of that in mind of like statting things up, or this is exactly, we know that Sting glows blue in the presence of orcs and goblins, but beyond that, what does it really do, right? Obviously, it has the ability to maybe it has a bonus to attacking those kind of creatures. Um, but Glamdring, Gandalf's sword, we really don't know what its bonuses are because he wasn't really writing for that type of an audience. We could maybe infer through the text that there's a magical sword, but is it a +1? Is it a +2? Does it have the ability to do certain things? Whatnot, that kind of stuff. So it's interesting that we have these magical weapons, but they're not outright like this is what this does, right? Orcrist was, I think, known as the foe hammer, so we know that it possibly did more damage to enemies, orcs and goblins or whatnot. But it's interesting to think about how we could assign sort of statistics to that for an in-game role-playing experience, if we do it all, and we'll get into that in a minute. Light is another very powerful effect in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and Middle Earth. And not so much light as in just illumination. Now we see that when the Fellowship goes into Khazad-dûm, Mines of Moria, we see that Gandalf lights his staff, right? At the top of his staff lights, a magical effect, and it gives them light to see by. But light is also referenced throughout the entire series as something more powerful. It is the light that shines in the darkness. It is a pure form of goodness and purity and righteousness, I guess you could say. Holy light kind of thing. It's the thing that banishes evil. It's the thing that banishes the darkness. And I found that really interesting as well, too. There's a part when Gandalf uses, I think it's the Battle of Pelennor Fields, he uses the light of his staff to drive away the Nazgul. And it's interesting to think that it does it do damage to the Nazgul, but it simply reveals to them their darkness, the dark deeds that they had befallen to. And we'll talk about that in the next section when we talk about magical rings. So magical rings, we know that there are magical rings, right? There's that famous line that we all know and love from Fellowship of the Ring, when Gandalf and Frodo actually reveal the writing on the ring. And it's a verse from Elvish lore that reads, 3 rings for the Elvish kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. So again, we see this idea of light and shadow, this good versus evil, but we know that famous line of these rings that were created, and we know that Sauron himself created the 1 ring to rule over all those other rings. Thankfully, the 3 Elvish rings were never corrupted by Sauron, and we know a little bit about them. About the other rings, we really don't know much. The 9 that were given to men, we know that it turned them into the Nazgul, and the Dwarvish created greed in them, and isolationist type of feelings, and But of the 3 Elvish Rings, we know a little bit more. Tolkien gives us a little bit more um, uh, insight into those rings. So we know that they are Narya, Nenya, and Vilya. Um, Narya is alluded to the fact that it resists tyranny and despair. So we know that Gandalf wears the ring. He wears Narya. It's the fire ring, the red ring. It's referred to as both a couple of times in the books, um, and it's interesting that he has it to resist tyranny and despair. A being as powerful as Gandalf is alluded to being needs the ability to evade or not be corrupted by despair is really immense. That the shadow, that despair, that corruption is always there, and in a sort of magical form through these rings. And then we have the One Ring, right? We know a few things about the One Ring. When worn, it turns the bearer invisible. We know that it was created to lord over the other rings, to corrupt the other rings, and it's indestructible unless bathed in the fires of Mount Doom. We all know the story of the One Ring. So rings were very, I mean, obviously it's in the title, right? Lord of the Rings. But it's interesting to see these types of things actually have sort of have sort of attributes to them, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Attributes to them that they have these certain abilities to do things. We don't really know how the One Ring corrupts all the others. It has the ability to turn the bearer invisible to other people around it, but we also know that when the ring was put on, that Sauron's attention was drawn to it. It's his ring, and he is seeking it constantly, and so the book refers to it as his entire will is bent to the ring. That he would know the instant it's being used. But beyond that, we don't know what sort of power it really has, other than it's constantly referred to as having this corrupting influence. Gandalf resists the temptation to take it. Galadriel as well, they resist the temptation to take this ring because they know that in them owning it, it would give them great power, whatever that power might be, right? But in return, it's also going to bend them to Sauron's will, and they would become thralls, very powerful thralls of Sauron himself. So how can we incorporate these ideas into a role-playing game? Well, first of all, it would take it's a very narrative effect. It's got to be something where it's pervasive in the world building that you're doing. To be able to drop this kind of thing into Dungeons and Dragons just doesn't seem to work unless you've stripped away all of the magic, the Vancian magic from D&D, and replaced it with this idea. It's about building awe of things. When the hobbits see the elves for the first time, these elves are these immortal creatures. Elrond has been alive for like 6,000 years. He tells them that at the council, and he talks about, I was there when the first, the alliance between men and elves first happened in the First Age. And so there's this awe of magical beings and magic itself. There's a point when Frodo becomes so enamored with the ring, so paranoid of losing the ring. There's this idea that the magic itself is not big, it's not flashy, it's very narratively based, and it's really based upon the fact of a game master being able to invoke the awe of things that are very powerful. So even having, even if you have a game in which you have magic users, or you have wizards, to have things out there that baffle even them. So like the Doors of Durin with Gandalf, that there are things out there that are more powerful than even these most powerful beings in the world. It's even the fact of like when Sauron, when Aragorn uses the Palantir and he looks into it, Sauron is even afraid of him, right? Because he is the magic. It's not even really so much magic, but his bloodline that would come and destroy this topple this regime, as it were. So to incorporate this into your game would be very, it would be work intensive, but it would be very much more of a narrative thing. It's not going to be a statistically based kind of magic, although it could be. You could make magic swords that have bonuses to hit certain enemies. We see that in a lot of fantasy role-playing games already. Magical rings, magical potions. There's that light of Gladriel that she gives to the hobbits that sort of gives them hope. It sort of instills hope into their hearts, which again is a form of magic, but it's not an outwardly flashy, I'm going to cast this spell. It's sort of a all-pervasive, inborn sort of magic. So interesting theory. I hope I did Tolkien's work a little bit of justice, because there's so much there, and there's so much more that I haven't even covered in this video, in these books and stuff that you could incorporate into your game. But again, it would be something like maybe using GURPS, and I'll talk more about this when I talk about MERP in a later video. I'm going to review Middle-earth role-playing game, and I'm going to talk about how magic is used in there, and it doesn't. We'll get into that later, but I hope I did Tolkien's work a little bit of justice in this video, because it's the magic there is wonderful, and it's very different from what we see in a lot of stuff that comes later. And I think that D&D, when it was created by Arneson and Gygax, set the bar for what fantasy was at the time, in that time period. And while some of that was influenced by Tolkien, there were a lot of other influences, and it definitely strayed away from this fact that you couldn't really give statistics or attributes to a lot of the magic in the world itself. So until next time, I'm Questwise, and I am out. Stay safe. Game on, my friends.